Why a 3,000-year empire finally fell. The true story of ancient Egypt's collapse. For more than 3,000 years, ancient Egypt stood as one of the longest-lived and most remarkable civilizations in human history. Its monuments, rituals, and sense of identity survived famine, internal strife, and repeated foreign incursions. Yet even this extraordinary continuity finally ended. To understand why Egypt fell, we must follow a long, uneven decline in which internal fragmentation, religious and political crises, foreign conquest, and cultural transformation gradually eroded the foundations of pharaonic power. By the time the great port city of Alexandria rose on the Mediterranean coast, Egypt's old order was already centuries past its zenith. Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great and later the seat of the Ptolemaic dynasty, became the last glittering capital of an ancient civilization. Its marble streets, royal palaces, the pharaoh's lighthouse, and the great library symbolized a cosmopolitan, outward-looking Egypt that traded with Greece, the Near East, India, and beyond. But Alexandria and its rulers were also the end point of a long story of decline that had begun much earlier, when the cohesive authority of the new kingdom pharaohs started to fragment. The first cracks had opened in the wake of what historians call the Third Intermediate Period, around the 10th century BCE. As central power weakened, priests and powerful provincial families filled the vacuum. Shocking acts, such as the looting of royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, undermined a core Egyptian belief that the pharaoh guaranteed cosmic order and that the dead must be carefully preserved so life could continue in the afterlife. When the sanctity of royal burial was violated, confidence in the throne and the religious order it embodied was shaken. Into this vulnerability marched groups of foreign soldiers and commanders who had long served as mercenaries in Egyptian armies. Libyan generals rose through that vacuum and founded a series of dynasties that would rule Egypt for generations. They understood the necessity of projecting Egyptian identity. They adopted royal regalia, commissioned temple art, and wore the symbols of kingship. Yet this adoption often remained superficial. The Libyan elite frequently fought among themselves, and their rule lacked the deeper cultural integration that makes a conqueror truly accepted. The country became fragmented, politically divided and culturally ambivalent, leaving it open to further intervention. From the south came a surprising twist. The kingdom of Kush in Nubia, historically both conquered by and influential upon Egypt, rose to power at the very moment Egypt seemed to be losing itself. Kushite kings revered Egyptian gods, especially Amun, and treated Egyptian ritual and kingship as sacred. When the Kushite king Pa invaded in the 8th century BCE, he did not behave like a rapacious conqueror. Instead, he restored temples, undertook monumental building programs, and cast the Kushite line as legitimate successors to Egypt's old pharaonic glories. Rulers such as Taharqa rebuilt and embellished temples both in Nubia and in Egypt, and the Kushite dynasty briefly reasserted a sense of religious continuity and cultural revival. Their devotion to Egypt's past was so complete that they adopted native religious imagery, and in Nubia they even built more pyramids than Egypt would in later centuries. Yet revival was fragile. While the Kushites embraced Egyptian religion and art with sincerity, the world beyond was changing. In the 7th century BCE, the militaristic Assyrian Empire, a war machine unconcerned with local customs, marched into Egypt. Assyrian armies sacked sacred sites and imposed puppet rulers. Their violence against the temples and theocratic centers dealt deep psychological blows to a people whose identity was bound up with the sanctity of those places. Even when Assyrian attention shifted and local dynasties reasserted some measure of independence, the damage to Egypt's political resilience had been done. Parallel patterns of revival and conquest repeated. The Site kings briefly revived traditional arts and religious practices and oversaw a flourishing of mummification, a practice that in this period metastasized into the mass production of animal mummies for pilgrims. Worship of sacred bulls, ibises, and cats became economic as well as devotional. Animals were bred, mummified, and sold as offerings. This boom in religious commerce was a sign of continuing cultural vitality. But it also reflected a society increasingly dependent on ritual economies rather than consolidated political power. The Persian conquest, in the 6th century BCE, was another decisive moment. Persian rulers were expansionists, whose interest in Egypt was fiscal and strategic, rather than spiritual. The Persian king Cambyses II is associated in Egyptian sources with acts of sacrilege, stories that he burned royal mummies, and killed the sacred Apis bull, serve as stark symbols of the Persian contempt for Egyptian sacred customs. Under Persian rule, Egypt became a province contributing taxes and tribute, and though there were moments of native resistance, heavy-handed administration and fiscal exploitation weakened local institutions further. When Alexander the Great marched into Egypt in 332 BCE, the reception was complicated. He was a conqueror, but also a skillful politician who understood that to rule Egypt, he needed religious legitimacy. He presented himself as an Egyptian pharaoh, was accepted at the Oracle of Siwa as a son of Amun, and crucially founded Alexandria, a city designed as a bridge between Greek and Egyptian worlds. Alexander allowed Egyptian rituals to continue and plugged himself into the ancient lineage of kingship. And after his death, his body, mummified in Egyptian fashion, became a political talisman. The general Ptolemy secured Alexander's body and seized Egypt, establishing the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies presided over a remarkable fusion of Greek and Egyptian institutions. They transformed Alexandria into the intellectual and commercial hub of the Mediterranean. The great library gathered scholars from across the civilized world. Trade flowed in spices, silks, and grain. Ptolemaic rulers restored temples across the Nile Valley, and Greek and Egyptian forms of art and religion intermingled in new and sometimes strange hybridities. Yet the Ptolemaic state was also marked by internal contradictions that would undermine its longevity. The court became infamous for its extravagance and theatricality. Rulers adopted Egyptian pharaonic forms while indulging in Hellenistic luxury. Royal infighting, dynastic murder, crippling debt, and endemic corruption hollowed out the state's capacity to respond to internal unrest and external threats. These weaknesses were exposed when Rome rose to dominance. The Ptolemaic rulers relied increasingly on foreign mercenaries and allies to settle internal disputes, and their attempts to buy legitimacy and stability through temple patronage and public piety became prohibitively expensive. Cleopatra VII, gifted, multilingual, and politically astute, attempted to navigate this decline by allying with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. She embodied both the old Egyptian religious image by presenting herself as a living Isis and the Hellenistic world's cosmopolitan politics. Yet the rivalry between Antony and Octavian, the future Augustus, was the last struggle in which Egypt could remain independent. After Antony's defeat, Cleopatra's suicide and Octavian's annexation of Egypt in 30 BCE ended pharaonic rule and made Egypt a Roman province. The end of pharaonic power was not an overnight event, but the culmination of centuries of erosion. Internal divisions, the decline of the pharaoh's unquestioned divine authority, economic strains, the exploitation of religious institutions for profit, and repeated conquests by more centralized, militaristic empires all combined to render Egypt politically brittle. Its spiritual and cultural core remained potent enough to absorb invaders, so much so that many conquerors were Egyptianized in turn. But cultural assimilation alone could not restore the institutional strength required to resist powerful foreign empires. Even after annexation, the religious and cultural life of Egypt persisted. Temples continued to function for centuries under Roman rule, and many Egyptian practices adapted and merged with newer religious forms. Christianity would later transform the religious landscape, and many temples were abandoned or repurposed. A later rediscovery in the 19th and 20th centuries sparked global fascination and scholarship that revived ancient Egypt in a new way. In the final account, the fall of ancient Egypt is less an abrupt collapse than a long, multi-stage process in which the power to govern dissolved before the culture did. The pharaoh's political house crumbled even as the monuments and myths he had fostered endured. Paradoxically, the things that made Egypt unique, its monumental religion, its monumental architecture, and its capacity to subsume foreign rulers into an Egyptian identity. Both preserved it for millennia and made it vulnerable. Those same symbols that united a civilization also created focal points for conquest and control. When the political machinery failed, those symbols persisted as the memory of an extraordinary civilization that, though no longer sovereign, would live on in the world's imagination.